Hello and welcome to Ask a Curator Day here at TMAG. My name is Andre and I'm a member of the communications team here at the museum. As we begin today, I would like to ask you to join me in paying respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional and original owners and continuing custodians of the land on which we are standing today, and acknowledge elders, past and present. We're standing here today in our fabulous This Too Shall Pass exhibition, which features portraits and still life works from the TMAG collection. And what a poignant name for an exhibition given the year we've had so far in 2020. This is one of my favourite spaces because there's a real sense of history here as you wonder about the lives of the people that you see in these fabulous portraits behind me here. So we're here today to speak to the curator of this exhibition and our Senior Curator of Art here at TMAG, Dr. Mary Knights. Hello, Mary.
Hi, Andre. Thank you.
Thanks for chatting with us today.
Pleasure.
So Ask a Curator Day is a really important initiative that museums around the world participate in because it gives people out there a chance to find out a bit more about what it's like to work behind the scenes at a museum. So thanks very much for participating, Mary.
A pleasure.
So I've got some questions already prepared for Mary, but we would love for you to join in and participate with us today. So if you've got any questions that you'd like Mary to answer, please do send them in through the comments function. So Mary,
yes.
Let's start with why you became a curator and what's your role here at TMAG?
Okay, so my name is Mary Knights and I'm the Senior Curator of Art here at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. And what a big question, why did I become a curator? I guess I was really passionate about art and ideas, really curious to sort of research the background and the stories behind artworks.
Fantastic. But you came to being a curator a bit later in life. It wasn't your first profession. So tell me a bit about how you came to be an art curator.
Yeah, that's right. So after school, I trained as a nurse, a registered nurse, which I really loved. It was really fantastic. But at the same time, I began to study art, first in Sydney, and then I came down here to the Tasmanian School of Art at the University of Tasmania. And initially I was engaged with things like ceramics and painting and drawing, but more and more I got immersed in art history and theory and philosophy and realised that that was where my passion lay. I then went on and did an honours and a PhD, but I zigzagged my way through the art sector and it's just been so rich and fantastic. It's taken me on exchanges and residencies and developing projects in places as far-flung as Glasgow and Paris, London, also around Australia. I was able to work here in Tasmania in a number of different roles, including Arts Tasmania as the Visual Arts and Literature Program Officer and at Hobart City Council, including managing the Carnegie Gallery. But I worked for a couple of years at a place called Irinju in the heart of the West Australian desert in an extraordinary art centre with Aboriginal people, remarkable painters. And I also spent 10 years as director of the South Australian School of Art Gallery, which was a very experimental, innovative, playful place to work.
Fantastic. Well, that's a really diverse background that you're bringing to the role here at TMAG. So I think you're probably in a really fantastic position to answer the question around what advice would you give for people out there who are considering a career at the museum and particularly wanting to work as an art curator perhaps?
Well, certainly working at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery is a dream job. It is so fantastic to be able to work with, so many people across arts, history and the sciences coming here with really diverse experience and backgrounds, all engaged in different ways with the museum activities. I think what I'd be saying to people in the arts who are thinking of embarking in the arts sector and building a career is to be prepared to zigzag your way through the sector. Study hard, you need passion and curiosity And while you're doing your studies, try and get some entry-level and volunteer positions. Also, maybe look on some websites like Arts Hub that gives you a full range of opportunities across Australia that you can get involved in. And one of my very favourite websites is called Res Artis. And so you can begin to plan where you might want to go in the world to do a residency. Of course, once COVID-19 is finished, it's a bit tricky now, but you can begin to think about, you know, where your career might take you.
Fantastic. So just building upon that, are there any particular qualities you think a curator needs to have?
I guess one of the things I love about being a curator is it's quite diverse. You do need to be passionate about research and art. You do need to be quite good at writing, and some of the qualities that you will learn as you develop your career are things like great time management skills, great budgeting, great project management, and you really want to be able to bring all of those things together and perhaps in a playful way, but also be able to communicate those ideas to the public and share what you learn with the people who are engaged with the museum.
I agree. I think communication is a really important part of your role. So thank you for bringing that up. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what a typical day for a curator would look like, and as part of that, talk about how you put together this exhibition, which is so rich in the works from our TMAG collection itself.
Yeah, I guess every day is different, but maybe if I just talk about some of the things I'm doing at the moment. This exhibition, This Too Shall Pass, it explores impermanence and the inevitable transience of life, beauty and material things. So in developing this exhibition, I went down to the archives and looked at every portrait that we have in the collection, as well as every still life, and began to list the qualities and think through the aesthetic, the way I wanted the exhibition to look, to think through the ideas behind the exhibition, and put together long lists and lots of images and begin to explore the ideas. And actually thinking about this very week, we're about to have stage 2 of this exhibition installed in a few weeks. It's 6 cabinets that will be in this space with some objects. And I've been researching the origins of the adage, "This too shall pass." And it seems that even though we use that saying in everyday life all the time, the actual origins are lost in the mists of time. But it's thought that it may go right back to the Persian Sufi poets, also old Jewish folk tales and Turkish legends. But I just got something very special this week that I thought you might like to see.
Yes.
One of my favourite things is when artworks arrive, and in light of the Persian origins of the adage, I spoke to a calligraphy master who's currently living and working in Melbourne, and his name is Amir Molaverdikani, and I asked him if he could create a calligraphic panel for us with "This Too Shall Pass" written in Farsi, just as a way of referencing right back to the Persian poets. And he then talked about just how to make a piece of calligraphy more sacred, more special. They were often traditionally decorated with something called tazib, which is an illumination in gold. And he got a friend of his, one of his colleagues, whose name is Freshta as a Bani to actually do this incredibly beautiful decorative work around the calligraphic words. And the words are read from right to left, and I just think it's such a beautiful sort of reference right back to the ancient origins of the adage, this too shall pass.
It's just incredible, really, that we have an exhibition called This Too Shall Pass this year, when that phrase has been so spoken of this year in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is something that you conceived quite some time before that even hit us. So it is amazing and fantastic to see this calligraphy.
I think also what's so very poignant is, as well as being a master in calligraphy, Amir works in a hospital in Melbourne.
Right.
And so he is, right there in Melbourne in the middle of the lockdown, and very aware of the suffering and the hardship and the, just the potency of maintaining hope. And knowing that this too shall pass. But also what was really wonderful in doing this research, I came across a really beautiful story that actually is a Jewish folk story that again references this adage, and so I might just tell it to you.
Fantastic.
So a traditional Jewish folktale recounts how long ago King Solomon tested the loyalty of Benaiah, one of his courtiers, by demanding that he bring him a precious ring that had magical powers. The king declared that if a happy man looks at it, he at once becomes downcast and gloomy, but if a person in misery or mourning beholds it, hope rises in his heart and he is comforted. But Solomon and the other courtiers knew that such a ring did not exist. So Benaiah eagerly set off on the quest. He spoke to jewellers and goldsmiths in Jerusalem, traders from Babylon and Damascus. He travelled far and wide, questioned world-weary merchants at distant ports, all to no avail. No one had heard of this ring. And finally, Benaiah returned home, and on the eve of the harvest festival, when he was to present this ring to Solomon at a feast in the palace, Benaiah roamed through the city despondent and restless. Wandering through dark, squalid alleys, he sort of mourned what might happen, because I guess to displease the king, perhaps he'd even lose his life. But he saw this poor jeweller with baskets of cheap trinkets laid out on the ground for sale, and Benaiah again asked about the ring. But the young man shook his head and said, of course, how could he know of such marvels? He'd never heard of such a ring. But the jeweller's wise old grandfather was leaning against the hovel and overheard the conversation, whispered into the young man's ear, and who called Benaiah back. And from one of his baskets, he took out a very simple, plain wedding band and engraved something on it and gave it to Benaiah. And the next evening at the lavish banquet, to the amusement of the courtiers and the king who was sneering, he unasked Benaiah if he'd found the precious ring. Benaiah leapt to his feet and gave this tiny, humble ring to Solomon, who looked at it bemused, soon became silent and despondent, and on it was engraved the words Gam Ze Yavor, which means, this too shall pass.
Wow.
So Solomon looked around and realised everything, the grand feast, the wives, the riches, all his wealth and power could simply fade away. And so in being a curator and looking for marvellous objects to include, as well as that story, I came across this very beautiful tiny ring. Apparently it's quite often a tradition for people, Jewish people, if they know someone is struggling or suffering, one of the things they might want to give to a friend is This Too Shall Pass ring. So this was made by a contemporary jeweller in America.
How special. And so that it will be going on display
It
here
will be going on
gallery.
display in one of the cabinets that will be coming into this gallery in a few weeks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that story, Mary. I think it creates such an evocative atmosphere around this exhibition. And I think it really highlights something that you alluded to earlier, that's a major part of your role is the research side of things, which some people might not appreciate. And the different routes that might take you to where you first might start off thinking that you're going to go down one road and it takes you down a completely different path.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, we might just get up and have a bit of a walk around now because I'd like you to sort of perhaps point out some of the most interesting or weirdest or some of the different works that we've got into this exhibition, because something's just caught my eye over here on the wall, this very, very large scale work over here. Just wondering if you could tell us a bit about this.
Well, this is an extraordinary work. James Gleeson was one of Australia's, well, probably the first surrealist in Australia. And this incredible work perhaps reflects his philosophical view of the world. He was born during the First World War. He lived through the Depression. He lived through the Second World War. He would have seen and heard about the horrific things that were happening in Europe. And I think this gives quite a nihilistic vision. You get a sense of transience, definitely, mortality, but also almost a nihilistic vision, as if, you know, there's gizzards and bits and pieces of seafood, and it's as if flesh is there, flesh will rot, and after death there's nothing there. So I find it such a powerful work. It's the biggest work we've got in this exhibition. It's called Nest of Premonitions. And
great name.
Amazing name. And we've also got the very smallest work in this gallery by the same artist, and it's called The Vision. So as a surrealist, he was really interested into this unconscious and psychology and dreams and nightmares. He was also a gay man in a very, very conservative Australia. And this image is over here on the portrait side of the room, and it's really a self-portrait. It's almost like, it looks quite tormented and powerful and psychologically intense, but very, very beautiful.
Fantastic. And I was just also wondering about these video works that we can see. So these contemporary works alongside the more historic works. And can you tell me a bit about why you, as a curator, decided to include those in the exhibition?
Tasmania is amazing, and we've got some of the most exciting contemporary artists living down here. It's a really vibrant place to be. And to bring together contemporary artists and works from the collection, I think, helps make a really interesting, dynamic exhibition. In fact, the whole gallery is sort of alluding to both history, the old salon hang, and sort of surrealism with strange juxtapositions. There's also mirrors so you might get a glimpse of yourself. But bringing together people like Sally Rees and James Gleeson, who are really powerfully influenced by the surrealists, was sort of quite I thought, a fun thing to do, but also philosophically quite powerful, because whereas James Gleeson has a very nihilistic vision, Sally plays with the idea that there might be something there after death. And this work, it's a self-portrait, it's called The Medium. And to create it, she videoed herself, then spliced the video, hand-painted every single frame, put it together, and then added a sort of strange sound installation. At the moment, she's got sort of like a weird miasma coming from her mouth, sort of suggesting the spiritual realm. And the sound installation sounds a little bit like sci-fi, a bit like the soundtrack to War of the Words. And as well as the surrealists being an incredibly strong influence on Sally, she's always been really interested in B-grade sci-fi.
That's fantastic. And so I'm just wondering if you can tell me do you have any interesting stories about how we acquired a particular work, or are there any works here in the gallery that perhaps you'd like to know a bit more about how we came to have them in the TMAG collection?
Oh, well, there's a lot of mysteries actually, and I guess because the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery's collection is quite old and it's been brought together over the last 200 odd years, different collections have come in, and sometimes the provenance is lost. We don't know every artist, so there's so many great stories yet to be uncovered. And I guess this is an amazing painting. It's a painting of Mrs. Jordan. She was a tragicomic actress in London. We think it was painted around 1790 by an artist, Hopner, who has painted Mrs. Jordan previously, and there's artworks by him in London. But we don't really know how it came to be in this collection. And I like to think maybe it's one of her descendants, because she had quite a scandalous past. As a tragicomic actress, she became very renowned in London, and she caught the eye of the Duke of Cambridge, and she became his mistress. The Duke of Clarence, and she became his mistress. They fell deeply in love. They lived together for 20 years. They had 10 children, and the Duke was he was the third son, and it was very unlikely he would ever come to the throne. However, as his brothers became sickened and it became apparent he was likely to become king, the family said, "Get rid of Mrs. Jordan." He went on to marry a German princess, Adelaide, who our city of Adelaide is named after. But I wonder what happened to all the children. Well, what we do know is that she was given an annuity, and she was given custody of the girls. He kept custody of the boys, and she was told that she must never act on the stage again. But one of her son-in-laws swindled, or perhaps spent a lot of money in her name, brought her to financial ruin, so she went back on the stage. She lost her annuity, she lost custody of the girls, and she did end up dying in poverty in France.
Wow.
So, an extraordinary life.
Yes, and what a tragic story.
Yes.
It just makes me think, Mary, you would be a fabulous dinner party guest with all these stories that you can tell. And so are there any particular artworks or objects that you would love to have in the TMAG collection that we don't already have?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I'd love to have more of is the Tasmanian contemporary art sector. It's been flourishing for like at least 30 years, and to have more of that collection, more of those artists represented, would just be marvellous. But there's also something that I'd really love to find one day. We have a statue of Medusa. It was sculpted in white marble by Franklin Simmons, an American artist, in 1880. And there's a story, and I don't know if it's true, but it's the one I've heard, is that during the Second World War, there was a young sailor who would come in and look at this beautiful sculpture of Medusa, a young maiden, right at that moment where her hair is beginning to turn into snakes, and perhaps he fell in love with her. But how the story goes is one day, and perhaps he tried to steal a kiss, he was seen running out of the museum. And on the same day, Medusa's little finger went missing. It appears to have been snapped off. And we have never seen the finger or the young sailor ever again. So I'm sure there's some amazing stories around that episode.
And wouldn't it be fantastic if someone walked in with that missing finger one
Absolutely.
day?
I've asked quite a few people if they've seen it.
Yeah, that's actually one of the first stories I was told when I started working here at the museum, and I must admit I thought someone was pulling my leg when I heard that for the first time, but it seems to be an enduring mystery.
Yes.
That would be fantastic to solve. So a question that is very topical at the moment is obviously around COVID-19
Yes.
and how the pandemic has impacted on your work as a curator. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, we have been so lucky here in Tasmania, but especially I think here at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, the director, the executive, the board worked really hard to keep us all safe. So we've been able to continue working right throughout the pandemic. And we've been able to do some extraordinary projects. We brought forward priority projects. So there's a children's gallery that's been developed that's going to open in April next year, and that is looking amazing. We've also been working on a website that will have a platform that's accessible to the public, so people will be able to search the full collection across art, sciences and cultural heritage, and go through and explore our objects online. We've also been rewriting the collections policy and integrating the Amaga Aboriginal Roadmap to ensure that our engagement with the Aboriginal people here in Tasmania, is really well consolidated and part of every project into the future.
And just picking up on that, there's a work down on this far wall here that's caught my attention. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that? Because I know that's by a Tasmanian Aboriginal artist, Julie Goff.
Yes, this is a fantastic artwork. It's called Timekeeper by a Tasmanian Aboriginal artist, Julie Goff. And it's a really powerful work in this exhibition. This too shall pass. Julie has brought together a spear representing the custodians of the land and Tasmanian people who have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And she's brought it together with a hand-forged pitchfork representing, colonial settlers working the land. And then it's fairly discreet, but there is a line right across the wall, and it's sort of alluding to the fact it's like a pendulum with time passing and fortunes changing.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all that we have time for in terms of questions today. So thank you, Mary.
A pleasure.
But just remember that you can ask questions of Mary or any of our curators anytime via email or on our social media channels. And also just a reminder about our great mystery tours that we have live on Facebook on the first Wednesday of every month. So please do tune in for those. And thank you again for joining us today for Ask a Curator Day. Thank you, Mary, once more. And until next time, that's bye for now.